Ooh. Kapow.
There's a fair amount of kissing in the Bible. It was a common greeting. But this kiss would blow them all away.
Rabbi!
With its complete insincerity. With this kiss, Judas was sealing his betrayal of Jesus. But why? Judas Iscariot, son of Simon Iscariot, was born in an Israel dominated by Rome. It had been a long time since the 12 tribes of Israel were united under King Solomon. First, the kingdom split itself into Judah and Israel. The Assyrians swallowed Israel, and those 10 tribes were never heard from again. Then the Babylonians wiped Judah off the map, followed by the Persians restoring Judah. Then the Greeks took over. Then came the Jewish Maccabean revolt.
For Judea!
And finally, the Romans. Judas may well have been like many Jews at the time, believing in the prophecies that a Messiah would come. The problem with the messianic prophecies was that they were vague on certain key details, namely what exactly the Messiah was going to do. Many assumed it would be a military leader who would put an end to this elaborate game of empirical table tennis and restore the nation of Israel. So Judas might understandably have been excited when Jesus said things like, "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword."
For Judea!
Or when Jesus whipped the money changers out of the temple.
Hey! Hey!
Whoa! 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 Hey! Why? Hey! Ha-ha! It begins!
Or when Jesus washed
The unclean Roman dogs from this land?
washed Judas and the other disciples' feet.
For Judea?
No, for you.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Jesus said to his apostles on many occasions that he knew someone close to him would betray him, which seemed to indicate that Jesus could see into the future. Then again, it might have been fairly obvious to Jesus that he wasn't getting through to all of his followers.
For Judea. Bow, da-da-dow, yeah.
It was difficult to see how Jesus could ever be the one to restore the kingdom of Israel, when the only kingdom Jesus ever spoke of was the kingdom of heaven, which seemed to be more about loving your neighbour and bathing them than instigating a nationwide uprising. Jesus' washing of the disciples' feet was reminiscent of Lazarus' sister Mary washing Jesus' feet with an expensive ointment. At the time, Judas was seemingly abhorred by this, citing that the ointment should have been sold and the money given to the poor. To allow such waste was hypocrisy. But Judas was no stranger to hypocrisy, as he had a habit of saving money for the disciples in order to keep it for himself. Which begs the question as to why Judas had ever been chosen to be one of the 12. Someone who seemed to have their own agenda, well-intentioned or otherwise, that would stoop to such betrayal. Perhaps Judas' actions were fed by his frustration, that despite all of Jesus' potential, his charisma, wisdom, and mystical power, there would be no revolution. For it had become clear that Jesus' plan was to simply walk into Jerusalem and quietly die. Perhaps the betrayer felt betrayed. Judas sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which was almost nothing. That would seem to indicate that it was never really about the money. Or perhaps he had decided to take matters into his own hands, hoping that Jesus' arrest would lead to riots and a revolt by his people.
For Judea!
Ow!
We will never know for certain what drove Judas to such a betrayal. Yet we know enough. He chose to hand Jesus over to be killed. Woe to Judas, who must ultimately be judged, not by his intentions or his fate, but by his action. A betraying kiss.
This was not an ideal situation for one Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. He arrived in Jerusalem the previous day to oversee Passover celebrations and was greeted with an angry crowd, clamoring for the death of a moderately well-known religious leader. He hadn't even time to unpack. When faced with such quandaries, Pontius often drew inspiration from great men in the past. Specifically, he often would ask himself, what would Julius do? For as long as Pontius could remember, he had wanted to be a powerful leader of men, and ultimately, Emperor of Rome. His father tried to explain to him that the emperorship was essentially a dynasty with little opportunity for those outside the bloodline to seize power. But things like facts cannot always overcome the passion of youth. The life of a Roman soldier proved more grueling than he imagined in his boyhood fantasies. But his desire to distinguish himself among the ranks stirred a bravery within him, as well as a ruthless streak. Pontius soon rose to the rank of prefect and was stationed as governor of Judea, a province at the very edges of the Roman Empire. Though he entered his governorship during a period of relative peace and stability for the empire, Pontius took it upon himself to immediately establish his authority. Previous governors had made efforts to respect the religious beliefs that dominated the region. Pontius met their relatively peaceful protests with ultra-violent crowd control. Pontius realized he may have been too eager to prove himself when he subsequently received a brutal tongue-lashing from his superior.
If your posturing starts a rebellion, it will be my forces who will have to descend upon Judea to quell it. We're at peace. Try and keep it that way.
In his desire for unfathomable power, Pontius often overlooked the path of fair, moderate governance. It was a technique he would have to work on. After his major misstep, Pontius maintained a hands-off policy in most of his governance, though he had anticipated there may be need of some diplomacy upon entering the political hotbed that was Jerusalem. But this was a situation he wasn't even remotely prepared to deal with. Pontius had heard rumors of this Jesus fellow, and he found it odd that the priest called for his death, it being a local holiday and all. The situation could be delicate.
What are the charges against this man?
He's told people not to pay taxes, and he claims to be the king of the Jews.
Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law.
But Roman law forbids us to do so.
This was true, and the mob seemed resolute in its intentions. But did they speak for the majority? And what of the accused? He remained oddly calm, despite the crowd's persistent call for his death.
Are you king of the Jews?
Jesus replied frankly, stating that this was the reason he had been born, to testify the truth, and that those who belonged to the truth listened to him.
What is the truth? Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?
This was quickly turning into the type of nightmare scenario that caused politicians to question their career choice. The crowd grew weary of the delay. Either a decision was to be made, or time needed to be purchased. In Passovers previous, Pontius had made a custom of releasing one Jewish prisoner chosen by the crowd. This man Jesus seemed the perfect candidate, as the only other prisoner at the moment was a rather unpleasant insurrectionist known as Jesus Barabbas.
Which would you prefer I release? Jesus, who you call Christ, or Jesus Barabbas?
Jesus, Jesus, Jesus.
Who you call Christ, or Barabbas?
Jesus, 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 Jesus.
Okay, there are two options and two Jesus. One who you call Christ, and one with the last name Barabbas. Who shall I release?
And then, as if things weren't already complicated, Pontius received a message from his wife, urging him to not have anything to do with this Jesus, for she saw in a vision that he was innocent. But Pontius had already done all he could to remove himself from the situation. His only hope now was that the people would choose to spare the fellow purported to raise the dead versus the admitted murderer. But the chief priests and rabbis stirred up the crowd and clamored for Barabbas' release.
You are certain you want to release Barabbas, and not he who you call Christ?
Barabbas, Jesus! Barabbas, Barabbas.
Very well.
Down with Rome! Revolution!
Barabbas' release only seemed to inflame the mob's resolve. Pontius balanced upon a knife's edge. As he would rather not kill an innocent man, Pontius proposed a compromise to the crowd, that Jesus be given a thorough beating, be adorned in ironic and painful accessories, and just call it even.
You are free to take him and crucify him yourself.
According to our law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God.
And what do you say to this charge? Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have power either to free or to crucify you?
If you let that man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar.
he had effectively covered his bases. Riots appeared just as likely if he were to enact or not enact justice.
Shall I crucify your king?
We have no king but Caesar.
So be it.
Immediately, Pontius began to doubt his reasoning. He decided to wash his hands of the whole affair.
I am innocent of this man's blood.
He then handed Jesus over to his soldiers to be crucified. Pontius found himself mired in regret and uncertainty. The crowd had been appeased, the riots had been avoided, order was maintained. But he could see no justice in any of it. This is Thomas. Thomas was also called Didymus, an Aramaic word meaning twin. We don't know for sure why Thomas was called twin, as there is no evidence that he had any siblings at all. Perhaps the name twin spoke to something Thomas was seeking. True companionship. One day, while working as a carpenter in his hometown of Galilee, Thomas heard a man named Jesus preaching in the market. Thomas was utterly captivated by the truth and power of his words. Never in all his days had he crossed paths with such a man.
Candles! Get your candles here!
He promptly gave up carpentry and threw himself into serving Jesus.
Okay. You are amazing. Totally awesome. Where are you going next, huh? Can I come along? Huh? Look, I'll just walk behind you. 10 feet. 10 feet? 10 feet, good? 5 feet? Can I just walk right next to you? Hey! Okay. All right. Can we switch? Switch.
Watch it!
Coming through.
Thomas joined the
Make way.
rest of the disciples, following Jesus wherever he went.
Sorry, excuse me.
While the other disciples appreciated Thomas' enthusiasm, they sometimes found him a little overbearing.
Hey!
Oh, man, this is so cool. You're so cool. What are we going to do next? Man, this is awesome. This is just like...
To be fair to Thomas, Jesus was doing some pretty awesome stuff. In Bethsaida, he took 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 hungry souls.
Ooh, that was awesome! You're awesome!
However irritating Thomas might have been, his devotion to Jesus ran deep. Jesus had visited Judea the previous year and was nearly stoned to death by an angry crowd. But when Jesus received word that his friend Lazarus had died in Judea, he was determined to visit his friend's grave, despite the danger.
Hey, where Jesus goes, we go. Where Jesus dies, we die. Come on, guys. Where's your devotion?
Thomas's faith in Jesus was absolute, and no threat of danger could change that.
Okay, then.
Awesome!
In Judea, Jesus led the disciples to Lazarus' grave and brought his friend back from the dead.
Even though he'd been dead for like 4 days, Jesus was like, Lazarus, come forth. And then there was this flash of light, which was totally awesome. And then Lazarus came out, all wrapped in burial cloth, and he was like, whoa! And we were all like, whoa!
Thomas
It was just
of course,
awesome.
very impressed. Thomas' faith wasn't truly tested until the crucifixion. Thomas is not specifically mentioned in the arrest of Jesus, but we are told that all the disciples deserted Jesus and fled. Thomas could not believe what had happened. He thought it impossible for Jesus to ever let him down. And yet here he was, alone, abandoned, without any explanation. No one had been more faithful to Jesus, but for the very first time, Thomas began to have doubts. When Thomas heard the news that a risen Jesus had appeared to the other disciples, his response was skeptical, to say the least.
What's up, guys?
He is risen!
Right.
The disciples told Thomas their accounts of seeing the risen Jesus, but the more they tried to convince him, the more stubbornly he doubted.
How great could he be if he just left us to fend for ourselves? Until I see the marks on his hands and place my finger into the wound on his side, I'm not buying it.
Jesus took Thomas at his word, and a week later, he appeared.
Oh! Whoa!
And upon seeing Jesus,
My Lord! My God!
his faith was immediately restored. However, this did not mark the end of Thomas' struggle to maintain faith. When Jesus ascended to heaven 40 days after the resurrection, Thomas again felt lost and confused. How could he possibly carry on without Jesus by his side? Traditions hold that after the ascension, Thomas was given the task of spreading the gospel in what is now known as India, which meant he wouldn't have anyone by his side. Despite this, Thomas accepted his assignment.
Blessed are...
Sharing the good news in India proved more difficult than he could have possibly imagined. But Thomas persevered, baptizing hundreds and founding a string of churches that bore his name. Through his ministry, his eyes were opened to a greater faith, a deeper faith, as he witnessed people who had never seen or heard of Jesus, and yet still believed.
Awesome!